Chapter 10, RMS Titanic, Monday, April 15th, 1912, 2 o'clock a.m. Light Toller nodded at Sophie in wide-eyed respect. That, miss, might be the finest action any of us will see this night. He held out an arm to hand her through the window, but a call came from the crewman manning the boat. We're full up, Mr. Light Toller. Lower away. Light Toller gave the order and then turned to Sophie. We'll have to find you another place. Come with me. So, if you remember, in the last chapter, chapter 9, at the end, Sophie went to give her mom a hug and kind of tricked her into pushing her onto the boat, but now there's not enough room for Sophie to go. The screams that came from Amelia Bronson were barely human. It's all right, Mother, Sophie tried to call down. There's another boat. I'll see you soon. She doubted her mother could hear her over her own wailing. Sophie brushed past the world's wealthiest people and followed Light Toller back up to the boat deck. All around, ropes dangled from empty davits. And on the forwardmost port side, the last lifeboat was just being lowered. Stop, shouted Light Toller and rushed over, towing Sophie by the arm. I have one more. They looked down into the wooden craft. It was full, even overloaded. There was not an inch to spare. Light Toller didn't say it. There was nothing to say. Sophie had saved her mother's life, but it seemed that it would be at the cost of her own. A large, round face with mutton chop whiskers looked up from the descending boat. Cease and desist, bellowed the familiar voice of Major Mountjoy. I yield my place to that young lady. Raise us back at once. His cries did not reach the sailors operating the falls, and the lifeboat continued to descend. In great distress, the major stood up and tried to climb back aboard the Titanic. His great weight threw the craft out of balance. It swung away from the hull and came back with a jolt. Two men stood up and jammed the major into his seat. Sophie could not make out their words, but it was plain that they were yelling at him as the boat continued down. In spite of her dire situation, a giggle escaped her. Even on a sinking ship, Major Muttonchop was still the perfect clown. If only Julie were here to see this. But she bit her lip. Thank goodness Juliana wasn't. She prayed that her friend had made it safely onto a boat. She turned huge eyes on the second officer. Is there any hope at all, Mr. Light Toller? Stay with me, Light Toller ordered, pointing to the roof of the officers' quarters. There were two more Englehart collapsibles, and a small crowd of passengers and crew were struggling to release them from their moorings. Their distance from the davit made them almost impossible to launch, but Light Toller had another idea. We might be able to float them away when the sea rolls over the bow. Despite the chaos of the moment, Light Toller instantly assumed command of the group working on Collapsible B. The complicated tangle of ropes was cleared away, and the men fell into place to lift the boat off the cabin roof. It was heavy and cumbersome, and the pitch of the deck made the operation even more difficult. Sophie ran over to lend her own strength to the task. It was like working uphill on the side of a mountain. She glanced sideways, and the mountain was about to be underwater. The forecastle was completely submerged now, with gentle waves lapping at the superstructure just a few feet below them. They would be swamped in a matter of minutes, if that long. Light Toller bellowed, Heave! A mighty effort brought the craft clear of the roof, but the man beside Sophie lost his footing on the slope, upsetting the balance of the heavy boat. The Englehart collapsible tumbled off the cabin top and crashed to the deck upside down. So they're all trying to get a collapsible lifeboat, like one that could be inflated, that they found. And they're trying to get that into the water. Sophie threw herself clear, narrowly missing having her leg crushed by the overturned boat. As she scrambled up again, her eyes focused on a slight crewman in baggy overalls laboring at the boat's peak. She felt an irrational amount of joy at the sight of a familiar face. Patty! Light Toller knew all too well the name of the stowaway who had been evading him for so long. Everything else forgotten, he drew his pistol and aimed it at the boy. Patty's reaction was instantaneous. He hurled himself to the deck just as the second officer squeezed the trigger. The bullet whined over his head and buried itself in the base of the first smokestack. No! Without thinking, Sophie attacked Light Toller. Shock rendered him momentarily helpless, and he held still as she beat him with tightly clenched fists. Can't you let him be? She sobbed in a fury. We'll all be dead in a minute anyway. In the past few hours, she had wrestled with Jack the Ripper, and now this officer. Just then, she would have been unable to decide which of them was the bigger villain. Light Toller broke free from her and stood stock still, a look of utter bewilderment on his face. It was the first time Sophie had ever seen anything other than decisive confidence on those harsh features. As if Charles Herbert Lightoller had never before encountered a situation that was not detailed in the manual of His Majesty's Merchant Service. In other words, he does everything by the book. He follows all the rules that their Navy has set out. At that moment, with the parties posed as if frozen in time, the deck lurched sharply downward, throwing all of them off their feet. Yet before Sophie struck anything solid, the ocean came. It was not a wave so much as the sea filling in the space where the wheelhouse and officers' quarters had been seconds before. So the boat was sinking like this, right? And now it's tipping back. And then they were well and truly in the water, swept off the Titanic along with the two collapsibles, one right side up and boat B still upside down. Nothing could have prepared Sophie for the cold. It was the deep, searing jab of a needle applied to every single inch of her body. Now, that really was some good figurative language there. It really makes me feel what Sophie was feeling. She began to pant uncontrollably with the racing beat of her heart. From her fingertips to her toes, her muscles cramped painfully, paralyzing her. The water closed over her head and panic set in. The adrenaline rush released her muscles from their prison, and the life belt buoyed her up. She broke the surface of the water in time to see people leaping from the sharply tilted boat deck, trying to get onto the two collapsibles. A lucky few made it aboard. Others bobbed in the black water, too stunned by the icy cold to try to save themselves. The agonized screams were terrifying to hear. She would surely have been screaming herself if she could have mustered the breath. She tried to swim, frenzied thrashing strokes hampered by the bulky life belt and her sodden clothing. To her horror, the collapsibles were drifting farther away, propelled by the swell created by the sinking of the bow. Try as she might, she could not manage to cry for help. So be it, she thought. The boats were her one chance at life. No one could last long in this water. She had to face the inescapable fact that the survival was slipping away. She stopped swimming and averted her gaze from the rescue that was not going to happen. There was a long, thick pole directly behind her, sticking out of the ocean at a 45-degree angle. So 45, that's half a 90. So a pole sticking up like this, so sticking up out of the water. Hallucination? No, it was the foremast. So like the big mast of the boat, like a big pole that was sticking up out of it. She kicked toward it with all the frenetic energy of a dying girl. Her eyes were clenched shut with effort when her head actually bumped into it. She clamped her arms around the wood and dragged herself clear out of the ocean's murderous clutches. So she was able to climb up and out of the water, so maybe that will help her survive.